Hello, hello. Here's our presentation. Well, friends, let's wait for all the participants to connect. I mean, not all those who can and will be ready. Literally half a minute. We'll give everyone a chance to stop by. And in about half a minute, we're going to begin our first session in our course with you. So for now, settle in, get ready, plug in, and we'll get started soon. Hey. I'm like this now. You can turn on the sound, say hello. Yes, good morning? Okay, I see we've got 4 people hooked up so far. I hope everyone can get in promptly. Let's see, those who can't will watch the tape. Yeah, well, I think it's about time. Perhaps someone else will join us. Good morning to everyone who is just coming in. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Post Profile Development course. And today we have our first class. Today we're going to talk about what a job profile is and what it consists of, as well as how to apply it in a company. In total, our program consists of 5 sessions. Today we're talking through 1 laptop to 6 people, all clear, all good. Thanks, Ruslan, then, if you can comment on behalf of the whole group. Today we're going to talk about what a job profile is. In the second session, we're going to discuss what are some ways to develop one, because you can develop it in different ways. And there have been very different approaches in my practice, dependent on timing, on resources. You can go very deep through interviews, you can go a little faster through talking to executives, you can go generally through questionnaires. We'll pick up on all of that in the second session. In the third session, we will talk about competency descriptions. Today I'm going to talk about why it's very important to pay attention to competencies in the profile, how to assess them, where to get them, and how to use them later. In session 4, we are going to talk about what tools are already out there that you can take and just use. These are ready-made competency libraries, ready-made job descriptions, where they are published and what benefits can be derived. And in session 5, we are going to talk about how to use the profiles that have already been developed in the most such basic, shall we say, HR processes are about recruiting, they are about development, they are about evaluation and performance management. This is what our program will look like. Today, let us talk about what a job profile is, what sections it has, why a company needs it, and what a job analysis is. We are going to meet him today, in general and more in depth in the second session. And let us talk about who should be profiling the post. I mean, what it ideally looks like. Of course, there are always different variations of the possibility. We will discuss such a typical approach. That is the plan for today. In case you are unfamiliar, my name is Mike Pritula. Here is a list of the companies he has worked for. If you do not count making a recruitment application to Alpha Bank, which is also to some extent a prototype of a job profile, the most densely was doing job profiles at Starlight Media, which is an STB TV channel, where we developed job profiles for many employees, creative, non-creative, then evaluated these employees and used these profiles in development recruiting as well. Next, in gamification, well, there was also a big project with Eng where we were gathering a lot of information about positions with the goal of implementing grading. In gamification, I worked more with the results of job profiles. In particular, I did grading for Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, and there too, we had to work very closely together. Perhaps in cases are startups. There were different challenges there. Here is a little backstory. The work relies on global best practices, a list of companies that I recommend always keep track of because they give the right kind of frameworks, the right kind of knowledge and research. I also want to say that you will all have homework assignments. After each class, completing the homework assignment gives you the opportunity to earn your diploma. A grade of 4 or 5 is a homework assignment. If at the first time that something does not work out, it is okay. I always give feedback and there is an opportunity to finalize the homework to still get a good grade and get a diploma, which you can then print out or add your own Olympics. So the profile of the post. Here we'll look at the kind of job profile your company uses. I'd say it's pretty close to typical to standard. That is, he is coming from a popular approach. So what are the sections that go? There are generally 2 parts to a job profile. The first part is the profile itself. The second part is the part describing the competencies. And both parts are very important. Although the part that describes competencies may seem so, let's say, not the most important, like competencies, some behavior, some standard set of words. But it's not. And today we will learn why. why it is very important to pay attention to competencies. What goes into the standard part of a job profile is the job title. That is what the job is called in the company. In principle, the company can follow its own approach here. From the point of view of internal use, there are no difficulties here. The more companies use common names, the more people understand it, and the easier it is to then translate that during recruiting. The structural division here is also very simple. It is in what division the position is located. This describes everything because, first of all, the job titles can be different, even if they are close, to understand that this is the profile for this position. The structural unit is also important because a company may have the same job title, but it will be different job profiles in different structural units. If the positions are significantly different, I would recommend considering a different job title, so you don't get confused later. Supervisor, well, that's clear. That is, there is a certain leader to whom one reports. It's better to specify the position title, of course, because if it's a person's name, they may change and then you'd have to update all the job profiles and employee records. Next, subordinates is a description of who reports to this position. Collaboration and interaction is probably, let's say, not the most common section in a job profile. It describes who the employee interacts with. That is, who they have horizontal interactions with in other departments or within their own department. It provides an understanding of the scope of the person's activities. Plus, this information is often used in job grading. For example, when evaluating positions. It's often important to understand whether a person has wide-ranging interactions or works mostly independently. Next is the purpose of the position. This is very interesting. It's sometimes called the mission of the position. Some companies avoid this part and go straight to the responsibilities. But it's good to have this section that describes why the position was created, when it came about, what problem it was meant to solve, what the overarching goal of this position is. It gives the person an understanding of why they are here in the first place and provides insight into how their work connects to the company's activities. Plus, it's a quick way to understand the essence of this position. When you're dealing with a large number of positions, say 100, it's difficult to read through each position in detail, but by familiarizing yourself with the purpose of each position, you can quickly figure out who's who, because this is how HR typically works with positions. It's usually some file with 1,000 rows, 1,000 employees, and we need to evaluate positions or do some other task. Of course, we're not going to display the functional responsibilities of each position in this file, but you can state the purpose of the position in one sentence, and it's easy to work with that later when making decisions. Expected outcome of the position. This is also a very useful section. Some companies avoid it because they think the responsibilities and functions are enough. But the expected result is much more important because it's much easier to develop a system of indicators, like KPIs, based on the expected result. Because the list of functions doesn't always give a clear idea of what's expected from a person. It's often more vague, and the expected result is more specific. Plus, it's very helpful to include the expected outcome in job postings. Because when a person reads a job posting and sees the responsibilities, they probably won't see anything unique in the text of such a posting. So for them, this job will be one of hundreds, but the expected result is quite specific to the company and gives more insight into what is actually required. The only nuance here is that a position's expected outcome can change over time. That is, when the position involves not only operational work, but also some transformational aspects, like a chief HR officer. They might have expected results like building a recruiting system, for example, but once they've built it, that result will no longer be expected. Instead, it might become about improving efficiency or strengthening the employer brand. So this part can be somewhat dynamic, but you shouldn't worry that what you describe now will become outdated someday. Because if it does become outdated, no problem, we'll just update it. In general, job profiles or profiles should be reviewed. You can call them either way, about once every 3 years. It depends on the company's dynamics. A company that's in its, let's say, mature stage of development may not have things changing much anymore, and maybe the positions won't need updating. A company that's in the startup or growth phase might have more dynamically changing profiles. So you can review more often. There can be various reasons why a company decides to review a position. For example, duties changed, a new employee transferred, they decided to revise. That's okay too. So overall, this document isn't something that's approved once and then always followed. It's quite a living document that you can return to and change things. And it's basically a good approach when a company recognizes that this can change. Next, core functionality is probably the most common thing that exists in job profiles. This is also used in job descriptions. Here, as a rule, everything is quite straightforward. Required experience describes what's expected from a person before they come into this position, i.e., where they've been, where they've worked, what they've done. And formal requirements are any requirements that may exist that aren't necessarily represented as some kind of experience, knowledge, or skills. These could be, for example, having a driver's license, having a certificate of English language proficiency, having clearance for certain types of work, and so on. In general, even citizenship requirements. Well, these are the kind of specifics that a person needs to provide. These are the basic sections of a job profile. And now competencies. Competencies are a very interesting part. We'll devote special attention to this in our course. Many companies treat this part rather superficially. They just write down the first thing that comes to mind. But that's not quite right. A good approach is when we carefully record competencies, preferably with indicators, either including indicators directly in each job profile or recording competencies in the job profile. And the company keeps a corporate competency description with indicators somewhere to avoid duplicating the indicators each time, depending on how you plan to use them. However, competencies can be at different levels. In this case, we have 3 levels: professional competencies, managerial competencies, and corporate competencies. Professional competencies are what a person should know in terms of their profession. Managerial competencies only apply to managers or those in a leadership role. For example, a project manager may have these competencies. And corporate competencies can either be universal for everyone, like in this case, or they can be individualized for each position. So in this case, we have a corporate competence section, but today we'll look at a scenario where a company, in addition to corporate competencies, also adds competencies specific to a position or group of positions. There you go. This is what it looks like. Now let's move on. So where is the profile applied? There are different areas where a profile is needed. Overall, I'd say that the profile is a very important tool, and it's quite popular for companies worldwide to have one, simply because there are legal requirements for it. So that any possible disputes or problems with an employee could be resolved by reviewing the job profile. So the first thing is that it allows us to clarify the requirements for a position where we can use the job profile to change a person's responsibilities, change the requirements for them, and thereby recommunicate what is expected of the job. This is called job design. Also, with the help of a job profile, a company can develop process designs, that is, understand what processes it has, use the job profile to describe processes and to optimize processes. Next, it's used, of course, in recruiting. Probably recruiting, from a business efficiency perspective, is one of the most important areas because quality recruiting can't be built without a clear understanding of who we need and who does what. In recruiting, a job profile is needed to describe the job opening, basically just to write it well. Also to select candidates. That is, based on the profile, we're going to look at the first example today. Based on the profile, you can build a candidate evaluation system. Onboarding and training of new employees is also built around the profile. When, for example, at the selection stage, we look at what a person knows and can do, and what knowledge they might be lacking a bit. Accordingly, we plan to provide this knowledge to the person in the first few months of their employment with the company. We plan to convey it to them. Further on, for promotions, it's important that with the help of the job profile, you can see what differences there are between where a person works now and where they would like to work. For example, if a person is being considered for a managerial position or a senior specialist position, by simply comparing 2 profiles and looking for differences, you can conclude that, in order for a person to move from this position to that one, they need to learn how to do this and acquire these kinds of knowledge and skills. The same goes for succession planning, or accession planning as it's called, which is promotion but more long-term. The job profile is also useful here because it allows you to see what a person needs to learn long term, maybe not even over a year, but over 2 or 3 years, in order to be a good candidate for a management position. And finally, performance management is another area where it's useful to use a job profile. With the profile, you can plan a person's evaluation, that is, by seeing the expected results, you can set goals and then assess what the person has achieved. You can also evaluate their knowledge, skills, and competencies, using, for example, a 360-degree assessment, and then, if we see that there's a gap somewhere, plan for development. These are the main areas where a job profile is needed. Let's try this format to answer. In your opinion, what are the top 3 areas in your company where job profiles are currently most in demand or will be in demand? That is, where is it most needed? How would you prioritize for your company? Please write in the chat. Okay, recruiting. Filling a position. So essentially recruiting too. Okay. If that's the assessment, who else sees a need for such a document in your company? Performance management, promotion. The variety of responses indicates that there is indeed a need for this tool in different processes within the company. Cool. There's also a nuance here that we're going to see that it takes some time to develop these job profiles. This is normal. Absolutely everyone experiences this. We may encounter a situation in a company where we need to do something quite quickly, and we don't have this information. This is a very problematic situation. I've encountered this a few times. For example, when a gaming company planned to implement grading and started evaluating positions, they encountered the fact that job profiles were missing. But luckily, the recruiting department had kept all the job descriptions. And because the company had been growing quite rapidly over a short period of time, the description that was in the recruiting system, in Confluence, covered about 70% of the people. This actually saved the project. If recruiters would not have prepared these conditional profiles at one time, it would have been much more difficult to implement grading. It happens in companies. When a company restructures suddenly, or a company buys or sells itself to a company, need to see the profile urgently, submit for some kind of audit. So these are the kind of sudden situations that can arise in the future, and having a job profile will make it very easy for you to get through and won't make you spontaneous, quick, immediately described. Let's move on. Here's an example of how this is used in recruiting. In recruiting, there is a tool called a scorecard or candidate scorecard. You'll have it here available at the link. How it works. For all vacancies that are created in the company, a document describing the job title is prepared, where it describes why the role is needed, the purpose of the position, describes the expected results, describes the responsibilities that in some way surface the expected results. And then the requirements are described. Professional here is called hard skills, behavioral soft skills. That's where they're divided. There is also culture fit, i.e. corporate values. There are also motivation expectations, salary fork, and other requirements. And then the different stages of selection are planned and the application of those particular questions, tools, or other instruments in order to assess the presence of all these requirements at the selection stages. And after such an arrangement has been made, at the interview stage, candidates fill out a 5-point scale score for each of the requirements for each candidate. Typically, here's the scale. This is a scorecard created in Google Spreadsheets. If a company uses an ATS tracking system, many ATS Scoreca systems already have it built in. Yes, for example, in Forest is configured, in Cleva it's built in. And where it is not there yet, it is gradually being added because they see that it is a modern approach. And many book authors project on such as the book, Who's the Number One Solution to Your Problem? A book like Top Grading. These are two of the most popular books on recruiting at the moment. They precisely recommend scoring candidates based on developed criteria. Of course, if we don't have a normal profile, a well-crafted profile, then this is all very complicated. I mean, there will be some hastily made-up clauses. Candidates will be evaluated hastily, well, and there will not be this connection of all stages together. Agree, for example, it will be much better if during the assessment, during the interview, uniform criteria for evaluating candidates are used. The same criteria are then used to create a development plan when the person joined the company, meaning the information is passed on. When we, for example, assessed at the entrance that a person's competence is a little bit lacking, We immediately transferred this to development. This competence is being developed. At the end of the year, when we evaluate employees, again, we have the same evaluation criteria because there is a job profile. That is, a job profile is a tool that allows you to link different stages of an employee's life cycle and different HR processes together. By standardizing what a person does and the requirements for it, then it does not arise that at the interview we evaluated one thing, when we made a development plan, generally there came up with another, when we summarized at the end of the year, then a third. When they were developing bonus systems, for what the fourth, it turns out to be such a patchwork quilt, pulled from different sources, not synchronized and not working together. And it is incomprehensible to the man. Here one was evaluated, here one is developed for another, paid for a third, elected for promotion for a fourth, and so on. Therefore, the job profile is like such a central source of information for many HR processes. For these processes to work as such a symphony, as an orchestra together. Okay, so one of the main approaches which gives birth to a job description or job profile is called job analysis or job analysis. The outputs are usually a job description and a job specification. And the description of the specification usually goes into one document. Position profile. Simply, as a rule, divided into two parts, that there is a description, there are responsibilities, tasks, reporting structure, conditions of performance indicators, and the specification is a requirement. And analyzed, the post is pretty detailed. Already in the next class we will talk about how it is analyzed, and the result of analyzing the post is used in all these directions that we have discussed. Going further, as usual, the company analyzes the post. I mean, sometimes a company has this misconception that the job profile is something where you can go and take it and use it, but in fact it is not. I mean, on the one hand, yes, some positions are described somewhere. They may be 50 to 70% the same as what you have. But just that kind of blind copying, it doesn't work very well. It's better when we understand the specifics of our company and we analyze the position in detail and then use something ready-made in order not to prescribe what someone else has already prescribed. This option is appropriate. So what are some ways to analyze a post? There are 5 most standard approaches and further simply combine these approaches. We will study this in more detail in the next session, because today we are getting familiar with this concept in order to understand what it's all about. We'll consider the first option is the most reports. When people write about themselves, what they do at work, that is, they are given a special diary, a journal. They write it all out there and they indicate what knowledge, skills they use in doing so, in their opinion. That's the first option. The second option is when there is direct observation. That is, someone is watching people, such as a business analyst or HR, and asking questions. 1, 2, it's pretty costly, it's a lot of time to spend. The third option, it's a little simpler, the interview. It's very popular when the interview gathers information for the job profile. The fourth option is to study all sorts of already existing documents, some instructions that a person follows when doing some work. And another option, which is probably the most popular, is questionnaires and surveys. That is, when employees are asked to fill in answers to questions in some document. Then it's collected, analyzed, and used to build a profile. More often than not, it is a combination of different approaches. Like these 3, for example. Let's move on. So who should write the profile of the position? More often than not, it is done by HR. That is really a real roving job, in conjunction with a person called an expert, a subject matter expert, that is, someone who understands the position. Subject expert should be the role model for the positions being described. So ideally, it's the kind of, the best representative of the position. It can be a direct supervisor, preferably one who has grown out of the position himself and knows it inside out. It could be a trainer who teaches this position. This could be an analyst who analyzes the performance of this position. Some departments have analysts. For example, sometimes there is a sales analyst in the sales department. He has a perfect understanding of what a salesperson does. Or it could be a highly skilled and competent professional. That is a representative of the position who knows all the steps, all the nuances, and absolutely everything. So if and when we describe positions, we don't always have to be the executives to attract. other people can help us as well. That's good news. Let's move on. Now let's talk about competencies. Competencies are very important in all of this. Now we'll get into why. In general, people started paying attention to competencies quite a long time ago. That is, the first such mention that was discovered was 2,400 years ago. It was written in a book by an Indian official, Potassium. He made recommendations on how the king should choose people, and clearly describes what qualities, knowledge, abilities, skills, and characteristics a person needs in order to be a successful official, and how to evaluate it all. For example, these qualities such as nationality, family background, discipline ability should be checked with reliable people. The candidate's knowledge of various arts is tested by experts in the relevant fields, well, and so on. That was the first mention. That is, even then people understood that selection was a very important stage. If we have selected the wrong person, then later on, it is basically difficult to correct that as well. 2,400 years have passed. Still not all companies are effectively utilizing the knowledge of job profiles and competencies. Often companies do everything manually, on a whim, and do not rely on any systematic tools. As a result, they make a lot of mistakes and get mediocre employee performance. Over the last 100 years, however, a tremendous amount of work, research has been done that have put the job profiles and competencies in order. There were different people who were interested in it. It was Taylor and Ford as one such major automobile manufacturer. And Taylor was an economist, a psychologist who studied human behavior. But the most interesting work that has been done in the last 100 years belongs to Mr. McClelland. He took a very deep look at, and what in fact influences people's effectiveness. He wrote an article where he said we need to assess competencies. This gentleman here, this is what he looks like. He founded a consulting company, and his company were invited by the US Department of Foreign Affairs to help evaluate candidates and predict a person's job performance. Since they often made mistakes, that is how companies usually selected people before they learned how to do it right. They selected simply by past experience and education, what college you graduated from, what company you worked for. So you either fit or you don't fit, all of them. As such, no assessment tools were used. But often people who just happen to graduate from this or that university, or just happen to work for this or that company, are not good or bad employees. I mean, it's always this kind of loosely connected thing. So this ministry asked McClelland to develop an approach. What McClelland was doing. He came up with an approach that many companies still use today, and you and I will be discussing it in the next class as well. In order to develop the requirements for workers, he began to study what, in fact, is the difference between the best workers and everyone else. As a future psychologist, he knew it could be discerned through questions, and he coined it from people. He was given, roughly speaking, great employees and so-so people. And he started asking people about some situations at work where these people were either succeeding or failing. I mean, I was like, tell me about a situation where you screwed up. As he listened to these people's responses, he started noticing how differently they spoke. Some people would talk about successes and actions, while others wouldn't mention those things. And they would use different words. Being a psychologist, he realized there was a difference in the responses. The difference in responses depended on the presence or absence of certain competencies in a person. For example, if someone had good teamwork skills, they would talk about how they utilized team resources to achieve success. If a person wasn't team-oriented, they either wouldn't mention the team at all, or conversely, would describe how they tried to do everything themselves and failed. Thus, he discovered that having certain competencies makes people successful. Furthermore, being a psychologist and knowing how to assess various competencies, he developed assessment tools that consulting companies then started using. And we use them too. For instance, the competency-based interview we conduct comes from there. The tests we can apply, like work sample tests, also come from there. So thanks to McClelland, we learned how to do this. Interestingly, many companies, Instead of analyzing their best employees and mediocre employees, finding out the real differences between these people and which competencies make some successful and others unsuccessful, many companies assess candidates based on their own notion of what makes a good employee. For example, let's say we have a sales department in our company with salespeople. There are the best salespeople, average salespeople, and the worst salespeople. The correct approach is to go to that sales department, study those salespeople, and understand the differences. Why are some the most successful while others are not so successful? Identify those requirements. And then use these requirements in the assessment process, of course. That is, they select people who meet these requirements. Next, of course, is development. If there's a secret ingredient to successful sales, it needs to be developed in all the salespeople we hire. It should be used in selecting people for promotion, bonuses, that is, in all processes. Instead, many companies do what they assume. They think, okay, we need a salesperson, so what makes a good salesperson? And at that moment, some kind of random idea generator kicks in. They think, well, we read on the internet that this is important. And it seems to me that these kinds of people will be good. Some companies actually analyze their employees at this point. Some companies make it up off the top of their heads. There are companies where managers hiring personnel are very experienced, very mature, who have recruited people multiple times, developed them, promoted them, fired them. They start to match their past experiences with the requirements, and they really start to come up with some sensible, specific requirements for candidates, because these requirements are based on their experience. But in young companies, for example, where managers are often guys who are 24, 25 years old, with no experience in managing people, no experience in hiring them, tracking how they work afterwards, evaluating, promoting, firing. And the only thing they can do is just generate random ideas. What makes a good salesperson? That is, sharing their thoughts, unsubstantiated and unproven. And at that point, some abstract profile is created which then doesn't yield the right candidates. People who aren't the most effective are hired, and then who gets blamed? HR. Why did you hire us salespeople who can't sell? You're the ones who recruited bad ones for us. We'll fire these ones, of course, but now hire us normal ones. But normal ones won't appear until we apply the right approach. Accordingly, what McClellan did is called a behavioral interviewing tool, in which requirements for employees are born not from imagination, not from a random idea generator, but from real situations. This approach is useful not only for competencies, but also for expected results and responsibilities. Because similarly, some managers, when describing expected results or responsibilities, rely on past experience, on understanding people, while other managers rely on what's on Google or the internet. So the question for you to think about in your work, specifically in your work, were there situations where you tried to find differences between the best employees and average ones? I mean, maybe you had some dialogue with managers. Maybe you conducted some interviews or research. Put a plus if you've had such experiences in practice, a minus if you haven't yet. Okay, I see some pluses. Excellent. Okay, good. Well, that's great. It's important to understand that creating a job profile along with a competency profile is not an abstract scientific activity, but rather a research process. It's more about gathering information within the company than generating theoretical information. That's essentially how competencies were born. Then there was another person who did a lot, Douglas B., who, together with AT, conducted employee assessments and developed competencies. They wrote a big article about how AT conducted the first assessment center. Many companies became interested and started developing the ideas of assessment centers and competencies. Well, that covers everything related to that. Let's move on. Accordingly, the main conclusion from these gentlemen's work is that success at work can be predetermined if one understands very clearly and in detail what the position entails and what competencies are required for it. But to understand based on real practice, not some templates downloaded from the internet, let's move on. If you're describing the required competencies for a job based only on responsibilities, you're not yet developing the competency profile correctly. This also needs to be internalized. That is, you need to gather information about the employee. Now, what is competence? There's sometimes confusion, that is, a misunderstanding of what is what and how things relate to each other. Our task today is to clarify this so that later, when we gather information and describe profiles, we don't get confused. Competence comes from the Latin word competentia and means authorized to judge or has the right to speak. Next, there are different definitions of what competence is. Some say it's a certain characteristic of a person that allows them to work effectively. Some say it's a kind of human ability. Some say it's behavior, it's the abilities expressed through behaviors. Some say it's a combination of different characteristics, again, which results in productive work. All definitions boil down to the fact that competencies are something that affects a person's performance. That's one thing. And many agree that competencies are mostly about human behavior. What's the difference from knowledge and skills? So knowledge is knowing how to do something and understanding it. Skills are more about practice and experience, while competence is the ability to apply. For example, if I know how to drive, I probably know the traffic rules, I have some experience, I know how to operate a car. There's also another model. It's said that competence is like an iceberg, which has visible and invisible parts. Competence is influenced by a person's knowledge and skills, but also by their motives, personal qualities, and how they evaluate themselves. That is some kind of self-understanding, self-awareness, self-confidence, and so on. Therefore, competence is a combination of elements that ultimately manifest in certain behaviors. How can this be understood? Let me give you a simple example. Why behavior specifically is important. The fact is that, for example, most people probably know how to behave in an emergency situation like a fire. I mean, if you ask a person what they would do if there was a fire and they were in the building, what would you do? They would say things like, I'd first notify someone about the fire, check if there's anyone who needs help. That is, they would be describing their knowledge about behavior during a fire. But if a person is put in a real fire situation, they're likely to not always act the way they say they would, because many other factors come into play, including reactions, characteristics, and motives. Therefore, knowledge doesn't automatically translate to behavior. Often in companies, it's the person's knowledge that tends to be evaluated. For example, a person comes for an interview and they're asked, tell us how you know to sell something to a client, and tell us how to behave in a team, or other such questions. And the person describes it very eloquently, very well, because they have the knowledge. But when it comes to a real situation, it's not certain that the person will behave in the necessary way. Why? Because they have the knowledge but not the skills. That is, they simply haven't practiced it. They can explain it theoretically, but practically, I theoretically know how to cook a certain dish. I can guess the ingredients, but if I haven't cooked it before, my dish will probably be mediocre. That's why experience is important. But also very important are things like a person's motives and motivation. Because for a person to do something, they must have the right motivation. If they don't have the right motivation, they won't act as needed. And in a company, it's very important that a person behaves in a certain way. That's why motivation is important. Let's move on. So let's summarize. Any person's performance consists of several components, some of which are their competencies. Psychologists and consulting companies identify three basic components of his or her, that is, the employees, efficiency, and effectiveness. These are what, how, and why. The what is answered by a person's competence, that is their knowledge and skills. The how is answered by competencies, that is their behavior. And the why is answered by values. Typically, companies try to manage these things. At the same time, people often confuse soft skills and hard skills, competencies with professional knowledge and skills. So, in terms of dividing concepts, it's common in the world to divide them like this. On one side, there are hard skills. Some people, to avoid confusion in the company, say hard skills or just hards. And that's exactly the word they use. This is commonly referred to as competence in professional jargon, or it can simply be called professional technical knowledge. This competence is what a person has learned for their profession, either at university or by reading professional books or in the workplace. The second part is called soft skills or flexible skills or competencies. It's how one behaves in managing tasks, managing people or relationships with non-subordinates, and managing oneself. Corporate culture is also about behavior. It's also more related to soft skills. That's why I recommend highlighting this when we talk about competencies in a company. It's about soft skills, it's about behavior. When talking about professional knowledge, skills, and abilities, It's better to say hard skills or professional knowledge, skills and abilities, or to talk about competence. That's how it is. Well, psychologists and researchers say that truly successful people are those who possess both professional and behavioral skills. For some positions, differences in behavioral skills on the soft skills side can lead to performance differences of several times. That is, people with the same professional knowledge can be very differently effective simply because they have differently developed behavioral competencies. Let's move on. It's important to understand that these behavioral competencies are about human behavior. They're not about knowledge or skills. That's why the word behavior is often heard alongside the word competence, because it's through behavior that all of this is demonstrated. And competence itself is measured by how a person demonstrates behavior. So to summarize, what is competence? It's a set of interrelated skills, knowledge, and personality traits that manifest in an employee's behavior and determine their success in performing work tasks. It can be said that in terms of describing a job profile, a correct competency description is about half of the result. Competency requirements. Competencies should be simple, fairly simply stated, observable, measurable, discrete, allowing for several levels of competence to be identified, covering all key work activities of a person, helping to distinguish between high and low quality work performance, and reflecting the language and culture of the organization. These are typically the requirements for competencies. Here's an example of a competency. What does it look like? A competency has its name, which is usually common and popular, and there's a definition or description. This is very useful because when we talk about a title, different people can imagine completely different things. I say achieving goals, I think of one thing, and you say and think of something else. But even that is not enough. For HR purposes, and for the company's purposes in general, any competency should be described with behavioral indicators. Behavioral indicators are examples of how a person demonstrates this competency in their behavior. They can be either only positive, then their presence indicates that the person has this competency, or they can be described as both positive and negative. Then there's a contrast, making it clear that if a person demonstrates these things, they lack this competency, and if they demonstrate those things, they have it. That's the best way to do it. Several levels are distinguished. The first level is called corporate or organizational. That's what's in your profile. This is when a common, identical set of corporate competencies is implemented for absolutely all employees of the company. They are often linked to values. This makes sense when the company is very homogeneous, and the company knows that for success in this business, it's important for all employees to behave in a certain way. This may work less well when a company has very diverse employees. There's manufacturing, there's office work, there are sales, branches, and accordingly, slightly different behaviors are needed for success in different positions. Therefore, competencies can also be related to a specific area, for example, competencies for finance, for sales, for office work, for HR, and so on. And competencies can be for a specific position for a specific person. This kind is rarely used when a company uses universal competencies for a family of positions. Most often, companies use either corporate competencies or some individual ones for each position. And some companies combine approaches. They say, here are 3 competencies that we want to see in all employees. And then each role has 3 more that are most important for that specific role. This approach also exists. That's the introductory information about job profiles and competencies. Your very first homework assignment today will be this. Considering the company's current processes and those that the company plans to implement, describe all the ways in which the job profile will be used in the company. I'll ask you to do this individually, not in a group format, so that everyone's homework is different. And the second part of the assignment, create your own job profile. That is for your position, based on your understanding of what a job profile is. We'll go into more detail later on how to do this, what questions might help you, and so on. But today, just compose it as you understand it. That's the homework you'll have today. Next, in the second session, exactly 1 week from now, we'll discuss how to develop a job profile, i.e., where to get information from, who to communicate with, what questions to ask if we're talking to a supervisor, what questions to ask if we're talking to an employee or a subject matter expert, or, for example, if we're doing a survey, how to conduct the survey. We'll look at these different methods in the second session. The competencies that we talked about so intensely today for the second part of the class, we will break down in the third session. We'll talk about how to describe them properly in order for them to really help you plan and manage people performance. In the fourth session, we'll take apart the finished product. So, we're going to look at exactly how to describe goals and objectives. Well, yeah, here in the second session, we're going to break down that part. In the second session, which is the top part, for example, I'll show you a profile example. In the second session, we will talk about how to fill this part, how to describe goals, objectives, where to get it. In the third session, we will talk about how to fill this part, about competencies. So what page is it on? In the fourth session, we will see if everything is ready, meaning we must first learn how to do it on our own without using anything ready-made. When we learn how to make our own, we will then look at what's off the shelf, what ready-made job descriptions there are, what ready-made competency libraries there are. That is, when you already know how to do on your own, you can use as such cheat sheets. That is, you're already guaranteed to not just mindlessly pick up and paste into your profile where it's taken from. And you'll take only what you need, take what you don't need, discard, combine from different sources, and generally get what's required. And in session 5 today, we saw how recruiting can use this. We'll be looking at more of these cases in session 5. Okay, we've got the profile, so what's the benefit of this to the company for HR? Where else can we use this other than recruiting? How to use it for development. For example, how to create an individualized development plan based on the job profile. We'll break down the personalized development plan template. We'll talk about how to evaluate employees with a job profile, how to manage performance, how to set goals, how to develop a KPI system, or how to implement an OR system and flesh it out with data from the job profile. That's what's coming up in 5th period. That's the plan. So I want to remind everyone that we have a Telegram chat in your group. There, I don't know, probably haven't all been added yet. So please add yourselves. And if you already have any questions about the post profiles, either about homework or about today's class, you can post there anytime. That is, not only before the class or during the class, but during the week some thoughts came up, some questions were born. Any work situations were related to the topic of this course. Write, and I will answer. Either I will say that, and on this question we will talk at such and such session in more detail, or some ready answer immediately according to the situation. In general, feel free to ask. Try to maximize this time to get the information you need for your job. That's all for today. If there are any questions about today's class, please write. If there are no questions, you can write that today what may have been some useful insight that visited you, on what you are useful for yourself you carry. Okay, message from Ruslan, colleagues, the folder where we will store the developed profiles and the sample I will send in the chat. Oh, that's great. You can, if such an internal folder in the Telegram chat to throw, I all inside will not be able to enter, well, and colleagues will see. Link, okay, all right. Will there be any other questions, comments? So, Mike, thank you very much. That was helpful information where competence came from. All right, chuckles. Thank you. And wishing everyone a productive day. We're meeting exactly 1 week from today. Thank you for the class. Damashka just top very helpful. You're welcome, you're welcome. Thank you too for being active. And see you soon. Homework is preferably done during the week so that you would have everything completed and ready before the next class. But for those who will have a vacation, suddenly have to be there or some other business trip, of course, you will have more time to execute. It's just a recommendation. Do one homework assignment once a week, it's not a drag. Then by the end of the course, you will have your work done and you will receive your diploma. That's it. Have a productive day, everyone. See you soon. Bye-bye.